The unsurpassed, profound, and wonderful Dharma is difficult to encounter, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of eons. Now that we have the chance to see, hear, receive, and uphold it, may we truly understand the authentic meaning of the Tathagata. For the sake of liberating all sentient beings, let us generate the supreme bodhicitta. Today we will continue our study of Entering the Middle Way, composed by Chandrakirti. As many of you already know, this text mainly explains the ultimate intent of Shakyamuni Buddha's second turning of the wheel of Dharma. Whether in the Tibetan areas, in India, or in many other places, this treatise is regarded as one of the most representative works of Chandrakirti, who is counted among the 6 ornaments and 2 supreme ones. I mentioned Chandrakirti earlier. In certain chronicles, such as the History of Indian Buddhism, there are also some introductions to him. He was born in a region in southern India. From a very young age, the positive tendencies from his past lives awakened. Because of that, he mastered both worldly knowledge and the teachings that lead beyond the world. Later, he went to Nalanda, the greatest Buddhist monastic university in India. There he taught the Dharma and served as an acharya. Around that time, another famous scholar arrived, also from southern India. His name was Chandragomin. He was also very famous. When he arrived, different historical accounts tell the story a little differently. Some say that Chandragomin arrived while Chandrakirti was giving a teaching. When he came in, he simply stood there quietly. According to Indian custom, if someone stands beside the assembly while a teaching is going on, it usually means one of 2 things. Either he has come to debate or he has some other important matter. Chandrakirti asked him, "Where have you come from?" He replied, "I've come from southern India." Then Chandrakirti asked, "What teachings have you studied?" He said, "I have studied the Chandragomin's grammar treatise. I have also studied the 150 verses on prajna and the Manjushri Nama Samgiti." Hearing this, Chandrakirti immediately understood something. The Chandragomin's grammar treatise represents mastery of worldly knowledge. The prajna verses represent the most essential teachings of the sutra tradition, and the Manjushri Nama Samgiti contains profound teachings connected with the Vajrayana. So Chandrakirti thought, this person must have a very complete understanding of both worldly learning and the Buddhist teachings. Then he asked him directly, "Are you the famous Master Chandragomin?" He answered, "Yes." Chandrakirti immediately said, "You arrived so suddenly, we should properly welcome you." He suggested that Chandragomin go outside the city so they could organize a formal reception and welcome him with proper ceremony. But Chandragomin said, "I am only a lay practitioner, an upasaka. It wouldn't really be appropriate for me to enter like that." Chandrakirti replied, "Don't worry, we have a way." So they prepared 3 chariots, some accounts say 2. In the middle they placed a statue of Manjushri. Chandragomin sat in one chariot. Chandrakirti rode in another. Then the monks lined up in orderly rows and went out to welcome him. During this procession, Chandragomin began praising Manjushri. As he went along, he composed verses of praise. Chandragomin was famous in India for his beautiful poetry. As he recited and composed his verses, something quite unusual happened. The statue of Manjushri gradually tilted its head to one side, as if listening closely. Originally, it was just a statue facing forward, but after that it remained slightly turned. Later, people said that the statue stayed that way in Nalanda for a long time. After he arrived at Nalanda, he and Chandrakirti spent time together, but they held different philosophical views. Chandrakirti followed the lineage of Buddhapalita and Aryadeva. His explanations focused on the Madhyamaka view of emptiness. Chandragomin, on the other hand, followed the lineage connected with Maitreya and Asanga, representing the Yogacara or mind-only tradition. So one upheld the mind-only view, and the other upheld the Madhyamaka view. Naturally, debates began, and they debated for many years. In fact, local shepherds even made folk songs about their debates. One of the songs said something like this: "Nagarjuna's view is very profound, but it can be both helpful and harmful, like a powerful medicine that must be used carefully. Chandragomin's view, however, is like nectar. It should be beneficial and easier for people to accept." What did they mean by that? They meant that if someone's foundation isn't strong enough, the Madhyamaka view could be misunderstood and might even cause confusion. but the teachings of Asanga and the Yogacara tradition are usually easier for most people to accept. However, during their debate, something interesting happened. Each time they debated, Chandrakirti's wisdom seemed incredibly sharp and immediate. When Chandragomin was questioned on the spot, sometimes he couldn't answer right away, but the next day he would come back with extremely strong responses. So Chandrakirti began to wonder, how does he suddenly become so brilliant the next day? He suspected that perhaps Chandragomin was asking someone for help, so one night he secretly went to observe him. According to some accounts, Chandragomin was staying in a temple dedicated to Avalokiteshvara. Other accounts say he was staying in a cave. Some accounts say he was staying in a temple dedicated to Avalokiteshvara. That night, Chandragomin began asking questions he had been unable to answer during the debate that day. And Avalokiteshvara answered them one by one, explaining everything clearly. Right at that moment, Chandrakirti walked in. As soon as he entered, the manifested form of Avalokiteshvara dissolved back into the original stone statue, but one hand had not yet fully returned. People later called it the Avalokiteshvara with the raised finger. It is said that the statue remained like that for a long time. Seeing this, Chandrakirti said, "Avalokiteshvara, how is this? Do bodhisattvas also have friends and enemies? Why do you teach him but not me?" Later, Avalokiteshvara appeared to Chandrakirti in a dream and told him, "You are under the guidance of Manjushri. You do not need my instruction." Still, Chandrakirti practiced intensely for 7 days, and eventually Avalokiteshvara also personally bestowed blessings upon him. So when we look at some historical accounts, we can see that the author of this text, Chandrakirti, was truly an extraordinary master. In Tibetan, there are a few scattered biographies about him, though not very many. But I think it is important for us to know at least a little about the author. Of course, regarding his wisdom, we already discussed that in the previous class. As we continue analyzing the text, you will see that his insight is extremely sharp, his reasoning very precise, and his language quite powerful. From the text itself, we can clearly sense the brilliance of his intellect. But when it comes to his compassion and his extraordinary spiritual attainments, we mainly learn about those through historical records. So after briefly understanding something about the author's life, we can now move into the main topic. Traditionally, in Tibetan Buddhist teaching, when masters give teachings on a text, they usually review the outline every day. They might start again from the beginning, first explaining the structure, such as the good beginning, good middle, and good conclusion, and then gradually moving step by step to the section being taught that day. That is the traditional style. But in our case, since many of you are also taking notes and recording the teachings, repeating everything every day would create a lot of unnecessary repetition. So I hope those of you studying entering the middle way will keep track yourselves of where we are in the text. When studying a philosophical treatise, each section is closely connected to what came before. If the earlier points are not understood, the teacher may assume everyone already understands them and continue explaining based on that foundation. But if the listener has not really grasped the earlier ideas, it can feel a bit like being lost in the clouds. So as we continue studying, it is very important that you keep the earlier teachings clearly in mind. Another thing I want to emphasize is that for some of you, this material may feel a little unfamiliar. If you have never studied Madhyamaka before and don't have much background in it, you might find it a bit challenging. It's not like studying texts such as the words of my perfect teacher or the way of the Bodhisattva, where almost every sentence is quite easy to understand. Here we are discussing something extremely profound, the true nature of all phenomena. And in the process, many great masters of the past debated with each other and presented different viewpoints. If we do not have a pure attitude, we might start thinking, why are these masters always arguing with each other in these texts? One might have such discriminating thoughts, but there is no need to think like that. These masters are playing in the ocean of wisdom. Using their intelligence and eloquence, they engage in a kind of debate that is almost like a game. As observers, we can simply enjoy it and learn from it. Each master has his own intention and his own meaning behind what he says. So when listening to these teachings, we should maintain a pure perception toward the great masters of the past, even when they present different views. At the same time, you should also think for yourself, using your own reasoning and understanding. Reflect on how you would interpret each verse. Think carefully about the meaning of every stanza. That is very important. For our study this time, we will mainly rely on the commentary by Khenpo as the overall framework and main thread for our explanation. I believe this commentary has a few unique qualities. First, it represents Mipham Rinpoche's definitive views. It utilizes his topical outlines and follows his perspective almost entirely. The author is someone truly well versed in Mipham Rinpoche's works, such as The Adornment of the Middle Way and The Beacon of Certainty, as well as other sutra and tantra teachings. He is extremely proficient in our own lineage's views of Mipham Rinpoche. Being deeply familiar with our own lineage's stance is very necessary. Second, this commentary is neither too long nor too short. It's just right. If it becomes too broad, in our Tibetan tradition there are many commentaries on entering the middle way written by great scholars that are incredibly vast. They are so long that you can lose track of the point. Sometimes it's hard to even find your way back out of them. If it's too broad, we lose the essential meaning, but if it's too brief, it might be too concise to be clear. The middle way is quite complex. The scholar Gendun Chofel once said that when he went to India, even the views of the Shravakas school seemed very profound and complicated. The middle way is the same. It looks simple, and entering the middle way doesn't actually have that many verses. But when you really dive into it, you find that the great masters of the past have been debating these points endlessly. It's quite fascinating. If a commentary is too short, it might not explain things well, but this one strikes a perfect balance. Plus, the author has his own realization and awakening regarding the middle way. When an awakened person writes, their words carry a certain inspiration and blessing between the lines. I highly recommend using this as a reference while you study. When I teach, I don't necessarily go through every single word and sentence. There is a difference between teaching, translating, or writing a word-for-word treatise. As a teacher, my goal is to make the general meaning clear to you. I have this sincere wish to express things in a way that helps you understand. Sometimes using too many difficult or profound technical terms can actually block your understanding. So while I might not express every single detail, a translated book provides a wonderful convenience for you. Now that we have the book, you can read it, use it as a reference during your studies, and use it later when you are teaching or tutoring others. I think this commentary is very suitable because it's not too expansive and not too brief. That's why I chose to translate it. Even though there are countless other commentaries on entering the middle way, I thought about it for a long time before deciding on this one. So we will use this content to give a simple explanation, and you can follow along in the book. Previously, we finished the second outline regarding the qualities of abandonment. In the last session, we talked about abandoning the three fetters. Upon reaching the first bhumi, a bodhisattva fundamentally severs the three obstacles: the view of a self, doubt, and the adherence to rules and rituals, shilavrata paramasha. This is truly remarkable. For us ordinary people, we are troubled every day by the view of a self and by doubt. We wander into wrong paths and hold on to all sorts of wrong views. Especially in today's world, there are so many different ideologies and schools of thought in society. These schools often don't help with liberation, and they might not even benefit your mental health in this life. There are many misleading teachers passing down dangerous ideas. We should try to be ethical people and use our wisdom to observe our environment and what we are learning and practicing. Today we begin the third section, Qualities of Realization. Such a bodhisattva upholds the state of supreme joy. Such a bodhisattva refers to those who have reached the first bhumi. What does such a bodhisattva practice? He is practicing the merits of the first bhumi. What have they attained? They have moved away from all the discordant factors we discussed, such as the three binding factors and the three things to be abandoned. Their joy is incredibly intense. In the secular world, we know how people feel when a business succeeds or when they start a family. There's an immense sense of joy. The joy of a first-bhumi bodhisattva isn't exactly like being wild with joy in a worldly sense. Wow, I'm so incredibly happy today. But it's not quite like that. I've finally reached the first bhumi. As other scriptures describe it, his joy is of a different nature. His joy comes from the fact that after reaching the first bhumi, he is happy because he can now benefit countless beings. They can mindfully remember the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and practice the vast merits of the perfection of wisdom. Because of this, he is already filled with a truly immense sense of joy. And this brings us to the question, why is the first bhumi called the supreme joy? Supreme joy is mainly about the happiness of benefiting sentient beings. Even though we haven't reached the first bhumi yet, as practitioners we should find joy in what is virtuous. This is very important. For example, we should feel joy in benefiting others, joy in studying and reflecting on the Dharma, and joy in practicing virtue and abandoning negative karma. Conversely, we should feel a lack of joy when we do something negative. This is related to a person's roots of virtue and their habits. So while following the example of the First-Bhumi Bodhisattvas, we should frequently observe ourselves. Truly encountering and learning the middle way view of Mahayana Buddhism is something very difficult to find in many lifetimes. In my own life, I've traveled to many places and met all kinds of people. And I've also had, how should I put it, I've experienced many things that people in the world envy, like fame or wealth. But I feel the most joyful things in my life were meeting my teacher, who was like a real Buddha, and encountering the Mahayana teachings. Even if I don't practice perfectly, just encountering this Dharma makes me very happy. I think many of you feel the same. To encounter the genuine Dharma in this lifetime is perhaps the most meaningful thing that could happen to you. If it's meaningful, you should realize it. If you're just confused and don't know what you should be happy about or what you shouldn't be happy about, that's not right. A First-Bhumi Bodhisattva is happy because he can benefit beings. He has moved beyond the sufferings of samsara, and when he experiences joy, it's because he truly dwells within the expanse of reality and so forth. Even if we don't have those qualities yet, we can think, if I hadn't met my teacher, I might still be drowning in samsara. Perhaps if we faced some hardship or pain, we might have even thought about ending it all. Many Buddhists tell me that if they hadn't found the Mahayana, the pressure of life would have been too much to bear. Having faced all kinds of situations in life, they might have already taken their own lives. They might not even be alive today. Many people feel this deep sense of gratitude. So, upon reaching the first bhumi, one should naturally be filled with joy. Next is the fourth section, qualities of ability. We just covered the qualities of abandonment and realization. Now the fourth point, the qualities of power and ability. And has the power to shake 100 worlds. Upon reaching the first bhumi, a bodhisattva gains many qualities, notably the 12 sets of 100 qualities. One of these is the ability to shake 100 worlds. You should think about this. When it comes to attaining the first bhumi, people shouldn't just assume they have reached the bhumis, because they might not actually possess these powers. For example, they can use their miraculous powers to shake 100 worlds. Of course, this shaking, as the Lotus Sutra says, this shaking isn't necessarily like an earthquake that causes terror. It's more about shaking sentient beings awake from the dark sleep of ignorance. It brings joy and positive change. In a single instant, they can enter, stay in, and emerge from 100 different meditative absorptions. In a single instant, they can see 100 Buddhas, and in the next instant, even more. In a single instant, they receive the blessings of 100 Buddhas. They can travel to 100 pure lands at will, and within those 100 Buddha fields they can radiate light and use their clairvoyance to teach or ripen 100 sentient beings all in one instant. They can live for 100 eons in an instant and understand 100 eons of the past and future. They can open or contemplate 100 doors of Dharma, and they can manifest 100 bodies from one. I think this was mentioned in A Journey to the West. A reporter once asked His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche, "I heard you are an emanation of Lerab Lingpa, but Sogyal Rinpoche is also an emanation of Lerab Lingpa. How can one person have two emanations? I'm a bit skeptical." His Holiness replied that upon reaching the first bhumi, one body can become 100 bodies in a single instant, so becoming two people is nothing, it's incredibly easy. That is exactly what was said at the time. A bodhisattva can also have 100 retinues and so on. These are just the brief descriptions. Later on, when we discuss the qualities of each bhumi, there is a long string of verses that explains these in detail. This is the quality of their ability. This is what the qualities of the first bhumi look like. So if some people think they've already reached the first or the 8th bhumi, it shows they don't really understand the scriptures. Many of these points are found in the 10 Bhumi Sutra. That's why we study entering the middle way. Once you've studied it, you basically know the qualities of each bhumi from the 1st to the 10th, what obstacles they abandon, and what abilities they have. We will gain a clear understanding of all these different aspects. We will also understand what happens beyond the 10th bhumi, the qualities of the Buddha bhumi, and how it is attained. All these points will become very clear. Therefore, our study of entering the middle way isn't about seeking financial gain or worldly success. It's not like studying design, architecture, or law, fields that have their own specific purposes. Our primary goal here is to achieve liberation for ourselves and to help others realize that beyond our limited imagination, there are profound truths that transcend the mundane world. Next is the fifth point, the quality of further advancement. Stepping on from one bhumi to another, he travels perfectly to the higher ones. What are the superior qualities that increase at this stage? It means that once a bodhisattva reaches the first bhumi, they use that realization as a foundation to progress to the second, then to the third, fourth, and all the way to the 10th. Their progress is continuous because they have abandoned all discordant factors and increased every quality of realization. Unlike worldly positions where one might reach a peak and then stagnate or even fall back, the first bhumi serves as the bedrock for all transmundane levels. From there, the bodhisattva moves steadily upward until after the 10th bhumi, they reach the state of no more learning, the stage of perfect Buddhahood. This represents a constant opportunity for advancement. These points we've discussed so far all pertain to the qualities that adorn one's own mental continuum. The third major section covers the qualities of purification. This is explained in two parts, a direct explanation and an explanation through analogy. First, the direct explanation. At that point, the paths to all lower realms are blocked for him. At that point, the state of ordinary beings completely ceases for him. What actually happens when a bodhisattva reaches the first bhumi, the supreme joy? Essentially, they permanently close the doors to the lower realms, hell, the hungry ghost realm, and the animal realm. All of these lower paths are completely closed off once one reaches the first bhumi. Now, we might think, wait, isn't it said that practitioners on the paths of accumulation and preparation, specifically at the stage of patience, already avoid falling into the lower realms? Why is this quality only attributed to the first bhumi? There is a crucial distinction here. At the stage of patience on the path of preparation, the lower realms are only suppressed. The causes aren't triggered simply because the right conditions aren't present. But at the first bhumi, the very seeds of these lower births are fundamentally uprooted and destroyed by primordial wisdom. This is a definitive shift. Once you reach the first bhumi, there is no possibility of ever falling back into the three lower realms. Furthermore, the state of an ordinary being or prithakjana is completely extinguished. We often use the terms ordinary being or worldling to describe those of us who are driven by our individual karma to wander and suffer in the 6 realms of samsara. That is why we refer to this as the state of an ordinary being. But once a bodhisattva reaches the first bhumi, this ordinary state is completely extinguished. Everything below that level, including the paths of accumulation and preparation, is still considered the ordinary being. In common terms, we distinguish between those who have entered the path and categorize those on the path of accumulation and preparation as practitioners, while those who haven't yet entered the path are called ordinary beings. That is one way to put it. A first-level bodhisattva is the only true noble one, Arya. Everyone below the first bhumi on the path of accumulation, everyone on the path of preparation, and everyone who has not even entered the path, all of them still belong to the state of an ordinary being. In common Buddhist parlance, we often talk about transcending the ordinary and entering the sagehood. This transition officially happens at the first bhumi. Many practitioners today have fuzzy concepts about who is a bodhisattva and who is an ordinary being, or what the cognitive and afflictive obscurations really are. Many are not quite clear on even these basic concepts. Whether they are explaining it to others or in the process of their own practice, they only have a vague general idea. Sometimes when they mention a bodhisattva, of course, it can be used as a title or name. Often when someone is a bit older, we call them old bodhisattva, old bodhisattva. But what a real bodhisattva actually is, just like what was discussed yesterday, strictly speaking, it refers to a first-bhumi bodhisattva. A first-bhumi bodhisattva possesses extraordinary qualities. Of course, in terms of conduct, we have those kinds of bodhisattvas as well. When you do some good deeds, people might say you are a living great bodhisattva. That is also a common way of speaking. So whether we are Buddhists or non-Buddhists, when applying these professional terms, we must be very strict and precise. Otherwise, we will just use them carelessly. Those who don't know the Buddhist principles are one thing, but for those who do understand, what exactly is the range of an ordinary being? At what point does one start being called a bodhisattva? Especially now that we are studying entering the middle way, everyone must clearly understand a true bodhisattva begins from the first bhumi. Anything else doesn't really count. They are just bodhisattvas in name or in their conduct. Ordinary beings can include those on the paths of accumulation and preparation, as well as everyone who hasn't entered the path, including non-Buddhists. All of these can be called ordinary beings. So if you tell some people that they are ordinary beings, they get very unhappy. Actually, there is nothing wrong with being an ordinary being. Take the path of accumulation and the great path of accumulation. You see, the qualities of the great path of accumulation are quite immense. In a single instant, they can use their miraculous powers to listen to the Mahayana Dharma before Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions. Even someone with that level of ability is still called an ordinary being. So we should understand these principles clearly. From the First-Bhumi Bodhisattva onward, as explained in the Wish-Fulfilling Treasure, we untie the 4 wheels. The paths of accumulation, preparation, seeing and meditation. The knots are untied respectively at the navel, heart, throat and crown wheels. The knots of the subtle channels, the 21 knots, all begin to untie from the first Bhumi Bodhisattva. At each Bhumi, 2 pairs are untied. Then at the end of the 10th Bhumi, meaning all 21 channel knots, they are completely untied upon attaining the Buddha Bhumi. Upon untying them, the fruition of no more learning is achieved. In various contexts across Sutra and Tantra, there are specific practices and their corresponding concepts. Next, the explanation continues. This is the explanation using an analogy. We just mentioned how he is distanced from the lower realms, meaning that he has attained the noble state. Now, for the explanation by analogy, his is described clearly in terms akin to the 8th Arya. What is the first Bhumi Bodhisattva really like? What is their actual situation? To explain it to the Shravakas, we use an analogy. Don't you have a noble being called the 8th Arya? It is just like that 8th saint. The first Bhumi Bodhisattva here is the same. What does the 8th Arya refer to? Those who have studied the Abhidharma Kosha will know, otherwise this will be quite unfamiliar. It can only be explained like this. Regarding the Arya as defined in the Abhidharma Kosha, if we count in the forward order, candidate and fruition of stream enterer, candidate and fruition of once returner, candidate and fruition of non-returner, and candidate and fruition of arhat. Counting forward, from the stream enterer candidate to the fruition of arhatship, there are 8 noble attainments. The stages of the noble ones are arranged like this. When it says it's just like the 8th Arya, it's counting in the reverse order. We start counting from the candidate for arhatship, candidate and fruition of arhat, candidate and fruition of non-returner, candidate and fruition of once returner, and finally candidate and fruition of stream enterer. If we count from the candidate for arhatship, who is the 8th noble saint, it is the stream enterer fruition. The stream enterer fruition is the path of seeing in the Shravakayana. At this stage, one has abandoned all afflictions of the path of seeing. What this means here is, don't you Shravakas speak of the 8th among the 8 noble fruits. Counting from the reverse, the 8th one has essentially extinguished all afflictions and distanced himself from all ordinary states. Starting from all primordial wisdom of the path of seeing, our Mahayana first Bhumi Bodhisattva is also equivalent to your 8th noble fruit. In this way, the Shravakas can fully understand it based on their own terminology. This should be made clear. Regarding this explanation, we just started counting from the candidate for arhatship. Mipham Rinpoche also calculates it this way, and the Sakya Master Gorampa, he also starts counting from the candidate for arhatship. So they identify the 8th noble one as the stream enterer fruition. However, Chandrakirti's auto-commentary on entering the middle way states that because a candidate for stream entry internally realizes the noble Dharma is already free from all faults, so it seems to refer specifically to the stream enterer candidate. Tsongkhapa also held this view at the time, that the 8th noble one is the stream enterer candidate. But if we look at it from a practical standpoint, the difference is not very large between the stream enterer candidate and the fruition. Unlike the Mahayana path of seeing, the Shravakas path of seeing is different. In the Mahayana, it is realized in a single instant without any sequential stages of before and after. The Shravaka path, however, focuses on the three realms and the Four Noble Truths, and it arises sequentially through 16 moments of insight. From the first to the 15th moment of insight, it should be considered the stream enterer candidate, and the final 16th moment is called the stream enterer fruition. In fact, once you reach the 15th moment, the stream enterer fruition is obtained immediately after. So whether it is the candidate or the fruition, there shouldn't be much of a practical difference. However, following the auto-commentary on the Madhyamaka here, as it states quite clearly in the auto-commentary on the Madhyamaka, the conclusion is the stream enterer candidate. Some of our great masters of the past also used other scriptural reasonings to confirm this, that counting from the candidate for arhatship results in the stream enterer fruition. Now, in my opinion, these types of Madhyamaka debates might sometimes seem invisible or irrelevant to us, but the fact that these great sages debated them continuously means there is certainly a reason for their analysis. If they didn't even understand a simple point like this, then there would be no need for debate. Such extraordinary and great masters would not just engage in this for no reason, they wouldn't be debating, but their debates definitely carry other profound meanings. However, from our perspective regarding the 8th Arya, either the stream enterer fruition or candidate could work. In my teaching of entering the middle way this time, I will try to present all these different viewpoints in a way that integrates and harmonizes them. Otherwise, for some of you who perhaps haven't specifically studied formal debate before, hearing this guru said this and that guru said that, or this school versus that school, it might just seem like a mountain of contradictions. To leave you with that kind of impression would probably not be very helpful. And indeed, looking back now, back when I was in the midst of my studies, we spent every day and every night immersed in this, constantly debating whether it was the candidate or the fruition. My current impression of entering the middle way mostly comes from 30 years ago. I haven't taught it since then. So every single image, those scenes from 30 years ago, the academy's buildings at the time, the grass-roofed huts where I lived, many of those memories remain. It seems that for a person, sometimes these words and verses naturally bring you back into that space. Because I spent a great deal of time practicing and reflecting on this, I find myself transported right back to that scene. Although I don't seem to have much time to read extensively now, while I am teaching basically because I spent so much time on this in the past, it all remains very clear to me. But regardless, regarding the 8th Arya, the candidate and the fruition of stream enterer are quite similar. Actually, that is exactly what it means. Everyone should understand this. I don't know if I have made myself clear. It would be better to have an exam after the class. That would be good. Having everyone give a presentation would make it much clearer. Every single person should give a presentation. Next, the second point covers the qualities of magnetizing the mental continuum of others. This is divided into two parts, the direct explanation and the supplementary remarks. First, the first part. Even when abiding in the first bhumi of bodhicitta for full awakening, he surpasses those born from the sage's speech and the pratyeka Buddhas through the power of his merit, and his merit increases ever more. What is this mainly talking about here? It primarily discusses how a First-Bhumi Bodhisattva surpasses Shravakas and pratyeka Buddhas through merit. This is the main point. His merit is truly vast. Even as a First-Bhumi Bodhisattva who has only just initially generated the heart of awakening, his merit already surpasses that of the Shravakas and pratyeka Buddhas. And what is the reason? It is because his power of merit has increased to an extreme degree. This is the primary principle being taught here. First, we should also recognize this. As mentioned previously, when relative bodhicitta arises in one's mental continuum, it already surpasses the Shravakas and pratyeka Buddhas. Whether it is relative bodhicitta or the bodhicitta of non-referential great compassion, it is capable of surpassing the Shravakas. Shravakas are referred to here as born from the sage's speech, because in the past the Buddha taught them the Dharma, and after hearing the teachings they later attained the fruition. This is why they are called born from the sage's speech. Then there are the pratyeka Buddhas, as we knew before. They meditate on the 12 links of dependent origination and finally attain the fruition of a pratyeka Buddha. The merit of such relative bodhicitta or non-referential great compassion, this kind of bodhisattva far surpasses what He surpasses the Shravakas and surpasses the Pratyeka Buddhas. Why? Because his power of merit is vastly increasing, whereas Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas do not possess such vast merit. Now, in our relevant commentaries, the Sutra of Maitreya's Liberation is often cited. There is an analogy in the Sutra of Maitreya's Liberation. For instance, when a king's prince is first born, because he possesses the royal signs and excellent marks, and because his lineage is so noble, for this reason he far surpasses even the elderly ministers. He is after all the son of a king. By the same token, for our bodhisattvas who have just generated bodhicitta, the moment they give birth to bodhicitta, they are already born into the family of the Tathagatas. Therefore, by relying on bodhicitta and the power of non-referential great compassion, they far surpass Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas who have been practicing for a very long time. This is the first analogy. The second analogy, the Buddha also told the son of noble family, take the king of birds, the Garuda, in our world. When it is first born, the power of wisdom in its wings and its eyes is already very mature. Many other birds simply cannot compare to it. By the same token, our bodhisattvas of initial resolve are also born into the Garuda family of the Tathagatas. Relying on the power of the wings of his resolve, wisdom and compassion, and the quality of the pure eye of his great compassion, he completely surpasses all Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas. So this point is explained here. Because another principle follows immediately after, the meaning between these two is, what are the qualities of a First-Bhumi Bodhisattva like? A First-Bhumi Bodhisattva is very powerful. Compared to a Shravaka who has abandoned the afflictive obscurations, the Bodhisattva's merit already surpasses his. Even compared to a Pratyeka Buddha who has practiced virtuous Dharma for 100 eons and has abandoned the self of persons and half of the self of phenomena, the Bodhisattva can exceed him in terms of merit. A First-Bhumi Bodhisattva is indeed very formidable. This is the primary point being made here. Now, is a First-Bhumi Bodhisattva really that formidable? When it comes to the depth of their wisdom, the way wisdom enters reality, it is still a little bit. A First-Bhumi Bodhisattva is not that powerful yet. He only surpasses them in this regard when he reaches the seventh Bhumi. So here the relationship is sometimes a bit complex. Sometimes it seems to us you are just Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas of the lesser vehicle. What do you count for? One could say that, but sometimes even a First-Bhumi Bodhisattva cannot. Even from the second Bhumi up to the sixth Bhumi, in certain aspects they cannot surpass Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas. A Shravaka or Pratyeka Buddha possesses the full wisdom of the selflessness of persons, and added to that, he has a certain power of meditative concentration. He then enters the Dharmadhatu in that state. In some general aspects, the wisdom from the first to the sixth Bhumi cannot surpass him. So there is this issue, and how is this issue explained? Next we shall discuss it by way of supplementary remarks. When he reaches the Gonafa Bhumi, he will also surpass them by his wisdom. This was the biggest topic of daily debate during our time of study. Likely many scholars in the debating courtyards were debating each other day and night over this. On the surface it seems like when he reaches the Gonafa Bhumi he will also surpass them by his wisdom is nothing much, it's just one sentence. But the meaning of this one sentence is very profound. What does it mean? Are Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas really that formidable? Well, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas are still quite formidable. Why? Because a First-Bhumi Bodhisattva at this stage cannot surpass them in terms of the entry of wisdom. And what about this entry of wisdom? It is only at the seventh Bhumi. The seventh Bhumi is the Gonafa Bhumi. When he reaches the seventh Bhumi, the Gonafa Bhumi, then his wisdom becomes superior. If that is the case, the wisdom of a First-Bhumi Bodhisattva compared to the wisdom of Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, which wisdom is more excellent? It is not the entirety of their wisdom, as will be explained below. It is a portion of the wisdom. For instance, the following part is called abiding in the vast field of seeing and knowing one's own sphere of cognition. Abiding in the vast field of seeing and knowing one's own sphere of cognition. From this perspective, it is only when reaching the seventh Bhumi that one surpasses them. Before that, one cannot surpass them. This principle is something that perhaps everyone should reflect upon. One point is that when he reaches the seventh bhumi, he can surpass them by relying on vast field of his own seeing and knowing. Before reaching the seventh bhumi, even a first-bhumi bodhisattva cannot surpass them. It seems a bit difficult for us to understand it this way. The wisdom of Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas is just that of the lesser vehicle, noble ones who have realized the selflessness of persons. What is the reason that even a first-bhumi bodhisattva cannot surpass them? Actually, at this point we must understand the object of meditative equipoise for Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas is the Dharma Dhatu, that is, the meditative absorption of cessation, the concentration that extinguishes both sensation and the mind. Then, in the Mahayana, there is a concentration that is free from grasper and grasped. This is called the concentration of the Dharma Dhatu. Now, when we enter meditative equipoise, do we enter the Mahayana concentration or the Shravakas absorption of cessation? In reality, the Shravakas absorption of cessation cannot enter the Mahayana's absorption of cessation, because the Mahayana is much higher, the state of the first bhumi and above. For Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, it is generally very difficult. But some scholars say that at the level of the Dharma Dhatu, the object of the absorption of cessation, which is free from grasper and grasped, free from signs, free from all conceptual marks and deliberate effort, is a state where there is no difference. So on this point, many great masters of the Tibetan tradition began to engage in debate. What kind of debate? For instance, when reaching the seventh bhumi, the Gonapha bhumi, why is it that one can surpass them at this point? Why can one only surpass them upon reaching the seventh bhumi? Why is that? Because masters like Tsongkhapa and Rendawa stated that when a bodhisattva reaches the seventh bhumi, he can enter and arise from the absorption of cessation moment by moment. They often say moment by moment. Why is it that he can enter it only upon reaching the far-reaching level? Because at the Gonapha bhumi, he can enter it moment by moment. So, it is explained for this reason. This is also how Master Tsongkhapa and others explained it. Later, in his commentary, Gorampa listed Master Tsongkhapa's viewpoints one by one and began to sternly refute them, saying that such a view is unreasonable. How should it be explained instead? Because when reaching the Gonapha bhumi, the clinging to characteristics will no longer arise. For this reason, he can enter his own meditative equipoise. He enters this concentration because clinging to characteristic no longer arises. Mipam Rinpoche specifically, I remember there are probably 1 or 2 essays regarding this issue in his writings. In those he states that although the great masters of the past had different explanations, he believes that at the seventh bhumi, the Gonapha bhumi, one enters meditative equipoise in a spontaneous manner. In that case, in terms of realizing the Dharma Dhatu, there is no real difference between the first and the sixth bhumi. An arhat should also have realized emptiness, and bodhisattvas from the first to the sixth bhumi also realize emptiness. So in terms of this wisdom, it shouldn't be the reason. But why is it that only a seventh bhumi bodhisattva can surpass these Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas? The primary reason lies in the manner of entry. I don't know if, at any rate, I have some slight impression of it. You all should look into this more deeply. The viewpoints of the various lineages are certainly all different. Actually, here the Sakya, Gelug and Nyingma schools all have quite a few debates on this. The Gelug school says it's moment by moment. The omniscient Gorampa says clinging to characteristics no longer arises. And then Mipam Rinpoche, including in his commentaries on the beacon of certainty and the ornament of the middle way, often discusses these principles as well. Mipam Rinpoche says it is by the manner of being effortless. So why is that? I will first explain Mipam Rinpoche's viewpoint here. Why did Mipam Rinpoche say this? Because, as everyone knows, by the time a bodhisattva reaches the eighth bhumi, basically all deliberate efforts, just like a river merging into the ocean, are without any deliberate effort. Before that, whether at the first or the seventh bhumi, there is still some deliberate effort and some exertion. Some effort is required, effort is necessary. So before that, there is at least some. Therefore, at this point, because at the seventh bhumi, one naturally begins to extend insight toward the Gonapha bhumi, since one is about to reach the eighth bhumi. After the eighth in the 3 pure bhumis, no effort is needed, it is natural. So at the seventh bhumi, all afflictive obscurations, both co-emergent and conceptually imputed, have completely vanished as well. Furthermore, at that time, all deliberate efforts have already dissolved into the Dharma Dhatu. For this reason, the seventh Bhumi Bodhisattva naturally enters meditative concentration. Actually, at that point, moment by moment could be said, and clinging to phenomena no longer arises could also be said. I personally believe that by explaining it according to Mipam Rinpoche's viewpoint, it actually already explains the viewpoints of the predecessors, and it is also explained quite clearly in the auto-commentary on entering the middle way. The viewpoints in the Tenbhumi Sutra and the Lankavatara Sutra are also very easy to explain this way. When one reaches the seventh bhumi, this kind of deliberate effort gradually disappears. When deliberate effort is gone, when he reaches the Gonafar bhumi, he will also surpass them by his wisdom. In reality, the wisdom of the Gonafar bhumi is exceptionally superior. Of course, the wisdom is superior. This has already been explained in Khenpo's commentary. Actually, between the first and sixth bhumis, as well as for the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, there is a genuine realization of the selflessness of persons. Otherwise, it would be impossible to attain the noble fruitions. But what is the primary reason for what is being said here? Actually, logically speaking, the selflessness of persons realized by Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas is also the true selflessness taught in the Mahayana. If you do not understand this Mahayana level selflessness, then saying you have realized the selflessness of persons is somewhat problematic. Does not the Nagarjuna's precious garland say, whenever there is grasping at the aggregates, at that time there is self-grasping? Once there is grasping at a self, then grasping, craving and birth, all of these come out in a continuous chain. In that case, later on, when he uses three types of scriptural authority to perform a detailed analysis, it shows that if you haven't understood the emptiness taught in the Mahayana, it is difficult to say you have truly realized it. Therefore, when it comes to the seventh Bhumi Bodhisattva, his manner of entering meditative equipoise is different. Moreover, it is because he enters meditative equipoise in a completely effortless manner that he is able to surpass them upon reaching the seventh Bhumi. Of course, from the perspective of realization, we used to say this often. For instance, is the state realized by Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas more excellent? Or is the realization of a first Bhumi Bodhisattva more excellent? Or perhaps the realization of a sixth Bhumi Bodhisattva? Actually, from the perspective of realization, on the level of the ultimate reality, there is no difference. On the level of meditative equipoise, there is no difference. From the perspective of the qualities of the post-meditative state, of course, there is a difference. But regarding the entry into meditative equipoise, according to the Lankavatara Sutra and the Tenbhumi Sutra, there is indeed a difference. Because of these principles, we can only make inferences through scriptural authority. Without scriptural authority, we would have no way to know ourselves. So the most fundamental reason mentioned just now is the vast field of seeing and knowing one's own sphere of cognition. This is very important. Furthermore, if we use the Tenbhumi Sutra for verification, the Tenbhumi Sutra also says, for instance, a prince of the royal family when he is first born is after all the king's son. So at his birth, by the power of his majesty, he already surpasses all the ministers. However, his own power of wise observation is not yet sufficient. A newly born crown prince, for example, like the Prince of Bhutan, we often see nowadays in terms of his lineage, he is certainly superior, but his intellectual capacity is currently not mature at all. By the same token, a bodhisattva of initial resolve, or one who has just attained the first bhumi, surpasses all Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas in terms of his extraordinary intention. But it is not yet by relying on his own power of wise observation, because it is only when wisdom reaches the seventh bhumi that his own seeing and knowing becomes vast. At that time he can surpass all the activities of the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas. So whether looking at the auto-commentary on entering the middle way or the cited scriptural authorities, no matter what, the manner of entering meditative equipoise is quite different. For a first Bhumi Bodhisattva, it can also be said this way. Using an analogy, we can say that for a first Bhumi Bodhisattva, regarding his own intellectual power and the manner of entry, he cannot yet surpass them. It is only upon reaching the seventh bhumi that he can surpass them in the manner of entry into meditative equipoise. The reason is exactly what was just mentioned, the difference in the vast field of seeing and knowing one's own sphere of cognition. There are also some differences in the auto-commentary on this point. In Khenpo's commentary, he says that originally the explanations by the great masters of Tibet held various viewpoints. He said he had already explained this in other treatises. But I have forgotten, was it in the commentary on the Beacon of Certainty or a commentary he composed himself on the aspiration prayer for the flourishing of the Buddha's teachings? In those other commentaries, perhaps the different viewpoints of Gorampa, Mipam Rinpoche, and Master Tsongkhapa have already been discussed. But actually, no matter how it is explained, at any rate, we used to talk about this every day for many years, but in the intervening time I haven't really flipped through those texts. I don't know, but in some places it should be quite similar. The principles are likely these. I hope that you all, if you have reference materials, will look into it further. The consing, I am just tossing out a brick to attract jade, briefly opening up some lines of thought so that you can then observe for yourselves. Then the third point, the extraordinary qualities of the First-Bhumi Bodhisattva. This is divided into three aspects. The principle of the excellence of the paramita of generosity on this bhumi, the praise of generosity and the classifications of generosity. It is divided into these three aspects. How is the paramita of generosity here so extraordinary? At this point, the first cause of full awakening, the perfection of generosity, will become preeminent, committed to giving away even his very flesh. Giving becomes a sign to infer his unseen qualities. Here, when speaking of the First-Bhumi Bodhisattva, his mind of generosity is exceptionally extraordinary. He has no stinginess, and it is particularly easy for him. Giving to others does not cause him the slightest bit of annoyance or pain. So his giving, that is to say, such generosity, is also the cause for attaining the first bhumi. Because the first bhumi bodhisattva can surpass others, and the most primary way he surpasses them is through generosity. What does this look like specifically? For example, giving the flesh of his own body piece by piece to sentient beings, not only does he not regret it, but he is extremely respectful. He is very joyful and earnest. He is exceptionally happy. This is something we also see frequently. When Shakyamuni Buddha was on the path of learning, he often gave his own flesh as an act of generosity. Of course, there are some individual ordinary beings, like the author of The Wheel of Sharp Weapons, Dhammarakshita, who, although he had not attained the bhumis, possessed such firm and stable faith that the phenomenon of giving one's own flesh did occur in very rare instances. But what is primarily being discussed here? Is it a first bhumi bodhisattva? We can know this by observing his generosity, because originally the first and second bhumis are completely beyond our sight. However, although they cannot be seen, there is another kind of behavior through which we can make an inference. If a person uses their own body to perform generosity, then it is possible they are a first bhumi bodhisattva. It is possible. If during a life release someone falls into the river and another person goes to save them, using their own body to rescue them, whether that person is close to the first bhumi is also hard to say. So for a first bhumi bodhisattva giving his own flesh to others, this is also something we can infer, right? The 10 Bhumi Sutra also says, by smoke one can know that there is fire wherever the smoke rises. Also, for instance, where water birds exist, there is water. By the same token, one knows a bodhisattva through external signs. For example, if he gives his body in generosity, then he has attained the first bhumi. Or when hearing the teachings on emptiness, his heart is filled with great joy, repeated joy, tears stream down, or his hairs stand on end, and so forth. These are also a kind of inference. So through inference, we also know of the first bhumi bodhisattvas. A first bhumi bodhisattva is originally invisible, but we can know of them through reasoning. So here the primary discussion is the extraordinary qualities of the first bhumi bodhisattva. We also hope that in the future we ourselves will truly give up our own bodies to protect sentient beings using our own flesh and blood as an offering, just as the Buddha did while on the path of learning. This is also something very much worth rejoicing in. Alright, that is all for today's introduction.
Bandara